You can usually tell when you walk through the door of a manufacturing plant whether or not the necessary quality controls are in place.
I'm not saying all of them, but most Vietnamese manufacturers is like that.
That Vietnam was probably some years behind China in terms of its
Xin chào quý vị và các bạn, tôi rất vui có mặt ở đây ngày hôm nay và đồng hành cùng với tôi là Mr. Trevor Purdey. So, Mr. Trevor là một chuyên gia về chất lượng, là người ở UK và đã có kinh nghiệm làm việc hơn 40 năm về chất lượng tại Trung Quốc và Việt Nam. Có mặt ở đây ngày hôm nay chúng tôi cũng sẽ chia sẻ về những kinh nghiệm của Trevor trong quá trình làm việc tại Việt Nam và Trung Quốc. Alright, thank you very much for coming here, Trevor. I hope you have a good time in Vietnam.
Yes, I've had a very good time in Vietnam. Thank you for the invitation.
Alright, so you are certainly one of the most experienced quality engineers, quality expert that I've ever met. So do you mind sharing with us a little bit about yourself as well as your career path?
Yeah, sure. Apprenticeship for 5 years, studying various manufacturing techniques, and I've worked in engineering now for 46 years.
46 years?
Yes.
Oh my God,
years.
okay.
For 30 of those years in manufacturing.
Okay.
And the last 16 more concerned with issues around quality.
All right.
And at the moment, I am quality and production engineer. My work is split approximately 50-50, quality and engineering and technical.
All right, thank you very much. So to be more specific, what kind of industry were you involved?
Yeah, I've worked in the automotive industry.
Automotive?
Worked in the space industry.
Space industry, right.
Rocket propulsion systems.
Oh my God, that's good.
And also combustion, combustion issues. And a lot of defence work, military applications.
Ooh,
so some very high standard quality disciplines.
Okay, so what do you think about when moving from very high-end rocket science, literally, and now doing mechanical outsourcing work? Is there any big difference? What do you think?
There's not a lot of difference in the actual manufacturing processes that happen. The big difference is in the quality assurance and quality control.
Okay.
Because the customer obviously has a much higher demand of the products, and the documentation is a key part of that control.
Yeah. From what you have seen of the local manufacturers, now they are rather doing a little bit simpler, lower end kind of product.
Yep.
Do you see a potential of Vietnamese manufacturer to move up the supply chain and doing more complex product like for oil and gas or aerospace maybe?
Yes, I do. There are many similarities between basic commercial products and more high-end, high-quality products.
What's the key difference?
The key difference is the supplier's ability to adopt standards, working standards and quality practices, like the ISO accreditation, for example.
All right. So talking about ISOs, isn't it a very common thing to have across all of the manufacturers, both in Vietnam, China, or anywhere else in the world?
Yes, the well-acknowledged standard ISO 9001 should tell any prospective customer that the supplier can produce products of a good, consistent quality and minimize the risk of the customer receiving defective parts.
Okay.
Obtaining ISO 9001 accreditation is not easy. Certainly in the UK and in the West, there is a rigorous process of audits and testing required to get that certificate.
Yeah. So what about the Vietnam manufacturer? What is your impressions about the factory that you have visited?
I have visited a range, if you like, of suppliers so far, from what I would call a very basic capability manufacturing plant to one that maybe has more potential for developing into a more high-end manufacturing company.
Okay, but so far, what do you think about them? What is your impression about them? Are they good, bad?
My impression is that the suppliers I've visited clearly have a history of working with a set of customers, and they know what their customers want, and they are able to produce that product and satisfy that customer. From a potential new customer point of view, it's quite clear that some of the details within ISO 9001 may not be being fully followed at this time. You can usually tell when you walk through the door of a manufacturing plant whether or not the necessary quality controls are in place.
So you're saying that even though they have the ISO certifications, but the moment you walk through the door, you immediately can tell if they are following it?
Oh yes, for example, quite often the first thing you see when you go into a factory is where they receive their raw materials.
Okay.
And where they issue those materials from for manufacturing.
Right.
So ISO says we should be completely and fully in control of those materials. So if the storage facility for the materials is not clearly marked, or whatever the material happens to be, if it's not clearly identified, it's clear that there is a potential for a mix of material.
So there's a risk.
It's a risk. So that's one risk that should not be there.
Okay. What else? What else do you pick up when you go through factory doors?
Quite often what I will see, especially in high volume manufacturing, where we have CNC controlled machines manufacturing many high volume components at the same time. These components will be in containers lying on the floor with no real indication of which batch they've come from, when they were made, whether or not they've been inspected and approved. So that shows a lack of the in-process controls that ISO 9001.
Okay, and I think this is quite a common thing that I find as well across most, I'm not saying all of them, but most Vietnamese manufacturers like that. So what is your advice? How do they actually make the ISO certification a real thing?
Okay, well, audits are very important.
Okay.
I would like to think that there are independent audits of the company from an ISO 9001 administrator. That would undoubtedly raise any issues, and they would need to be addressed fairly quickly.
Okay. Is that something that the Western customer will always look at when they visit the factory?
Always. Western customers always ask for the opportunity, if necessary, to visit the supplier, and we always say yes, of course. We are confident in the ability of our suppliers, and customers will occasionally come and visit.
Yeah. So obviously, the selling part of the business is not just for the sales department, but it's actually for everyone, even on the shop floor.
Supply chain managers do tend to look primarily at price and lead time.
Price and lead time, right?
But the quality is obviously every bit as important, if not more so.
Yeah.
And so accreditations like ISO are taken very seriously.
Out of the three, which is more likely to be a deal breaker? Is it price, is it lead time, or is it quality?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
I don't think you can really place one above the other.
Okay.
But quite clearly, if the price is not right, the customer will not come.
Yeah. So because it's a very common belief, which I myself think is a disbelief, because a lot of people think that if you want cheap product, if you want fast delivery, your price might be very high. So you can't achieve three things to own together. What do you think about this statement?
I think in the West, we often assume that if the price is very low, the quality will be very low. So the customers have to choose an appropriate supplier to that.
So there's not a definite answer, but there's a range.
There is a range.
Yeah.
And we would always expect to aim for the highest standard we can afford to buy.
Yes, because obviously there are many examples, right? For example, a Toyota car. a Toyota car. They are both affordable, and there's abundance of them, and the quality is high. So I believe that it's not impossible to achieve all three things. What do you think about that?
It is possible, but the suppliers who manufacture parts for Toyota cars are entirely governed by the quality systems imposed by Toyota.
Of course, yeah.
So it would be almost impossible for a manufacturer of an automotive part like Toyota to make a serious mistake. Although I hear in the news recently, Mercedes-Benz are looking at potentially a recall because of a quality problem that could come in years after the purchase of the material. So even companies like Mercedes.
Yeah, can you give a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, sure. It has been found that some Mercedes-Benz models from 10, 12 years ago, I believe, are experiencing brake failure.
Brake failures?
Yeah.
Serious?
Due to either a design or a material, not a fault, but an area which is not as good as it should be.
So, yes, are you saying that there's no way in production that there is absolutely no quality issues?
I would say it's very unlikely that you will find any customer who has never experienced a quality issue.
Right, yeah. But the ISO is there to make sure that we keep it to the bare minimum. Isn't that right?
We should meet the minimum standards required by ISO, which if you have the certificate on for your organization, then you must work to those requirements. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yep. So I'm sure that you spend a lot of time in China as well. What do you think about Vietnam factories compared to China factory at the moment?
The impression that I was given before I visited Vietnam was that Vietnam was probably some years behind China in terms of its development from an engineering, manufacturing, supply point of view. I've been pleasantly surprised to see that, in fact, I don't think there is such a difference.
There's no difference between Vietnam and China factory, no?
I don't think there's as much of a difference as perhaps in the West it's perceived. No.
Oh, alright.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of people tell me that Vietnam is like 10 or 15 years behind China. It's not the case?
I heard the same, and from what I've seen of my limited experience so far, I would say there is some gap to be made up.
Yep. But which perspective are you talking about? Are you talking about the capacity? Are you talking about engineering level, or what perspective are you talking about?
Certainly not capacity. I would say from what I've seen in Vietnam, there is an abundance of capacity. Yeah. But in terms of manufacturing, machines that are being used and processes that are being used, they are probably a few years behind China and maybe a few more behind the West. However, they are still effective. They're still effective means of manufacture.
They're still effective. Yeah.
They might not be as efficient and economic, but clearly they still work.
All right.
The areas where I see more development needed is in quality control and quality assurance.
It's very encouraging to hear that. Thank you. Yeah. So, what is the best way for Vietnam manufacturers to improve their so-called quality mindset and practice?
I would say investment. If Vietnamese companies are looking to gain more Western customers, they need to invest primarily in quality and quality-related issues.
Okay, so it's
very rarely do I see a well-equipped inspection bay with environmental control and modern measuring equipment.
Okay.
Mostly what I'm seeing is a very basic line in measuring.
Yeah, of course we don't want to generalize everybody, but I agree. It's most of them are like that.
Quality costs money, so a lot of suppliers don't want to spend a lot of money to try and build quality into a product if it's already there.
Do you think it's part of something that the government or some other organization can be of support to the manufacturer? Did the China factory get that kind of support?
Yeah.
Yep.
In China there is an incentive to export, and so in order to export you need to satisfy Western customers' requirements, and it's no different in Vietnam.
Yeah.
You need that incentive
for export.
and additional help if necessary to invest to raise the level of quality from Vietnamese suppliers.
Yeah. So for our outsourcing companies, there are a lot of time that we do new product introductions, which means we bring an existing product might have been being produced in China or in the West, and then we bring it to the local factories in Vietnam to do it. So generally, what is the most difficult challenge to overcome when you do such project?
Okay, so the first difficulty, and this is where most of my time is spent, is ensuring that the new Vietnamese supplier fully understands the requirements of this new product.
Okay.
Because quite often drawings and procedures need to be translated.
Obviously.
And the new supplier needs to sample the product. It depends what it is, of course. If it's a casting or a forging, then there will be a lot of tooling to manufacture and to prove.
Yeah.
And that takes investment.
Okay, of course. So when you mention sample, I know in production there are many kinds of sample. It can be a sample, it can be first article, it can be a pilot run. Can you help the audience to differentiate those differences?
Sure. The customer would normally not want to place a production order for large batch quantities until it's proven that we have an approved sample.
Yeah.
So initially, the supplier will go through a sample approval process and will manufacture the part as best it can and provide those samples, usually a small quantity, 5 or something, to the customer. Some customers demand PPAP. I don't know if you're familiar with PPAP.
Yeah.
So there is a much more stringent documentation package required to prove that the samples are actually fully compliant.
Right.
So in the event that sample approval is given, then generally the first 1 or 2 batches will again be samples.
However, from my experience, a lot of suppliers think that a sample is just to look at, right? So the process they use is different, the tool they use are different, the material sometimes they use are different from the actual mass production piece.
Yeah.
So it actually poses a great risk between the customer and also for the manufacturer themselves.
Yeah.
I think it's a wrong mindset. What do you think about that?
It is. They are not true samples.
They are not true samples.
They're not manufactured.
So by sampling, you mean? By sampling, what do you mean?
By sampling, I mean manufactured manufactured using the tooling and processes that will be used going forward in production batches.
Same as a mass production batch.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a very different mindset about samples.
It's not always possible.
Yep.
To small batch prototype sample a component
100% same.
100% the same. You can't always do it.
We at least have to have that in mind, and we need to communicate that between the manufacturer and the customer, right?
Yes. If it's castings or forgings coming out of tooling, then we have to prove the tooling through samples straight away.
All right, that's good.